Think medieval assassins were cool, mysterious figures in black hoods? Tonight, we're exposing the brutal truth about why it absolutely sucked to be one. This is the first complete breakdown of medieval assassination reality. The desperate criminals, failed training, and broken promises that Hollywood never shows you. Because the real story involves rusty daggers, fake poison, and survival odds that would make modern soldiers weep. These forgotten truths reveal how desperation shaped medieval society, influencing everything from modern crime psychology to today's fascination with anti-hero narratives. Tonight, let these dark tales of shadow and survival gently carry you into peaceful dreams of a simpler time. No one in medieval times woke up and said, "You know what? I'd like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path you found listed at the local guild hall between blacksmith and baker. It wasn't something you discussed with your parents over dinner or planned for during those long winter nights when families gathered around the fire to dream about their children's futures. No, becoming a medieval assassin was more like catching a plague, something that happened to you when everything else in your life had already gone catastrophically wrong. Picture medieval Europe in all its unwashed, unforgiving glory. This was a world where most people lived and died within 20 miles of where they were born, where a bad harvest meant starvation, where justice was whatever the local lord decided it was that particular morning, and where social mobility was about as common as unicorns. The feudal system wasn't designed for second chances or career changes. You were born a peasant, you died a peasant, and if you were very lucky, you might accumulate enough possessions to fill a small cart before the Grim Reaper came calling. But life, as it tends to do, had a way of derailing even the most modest expectations. Wars swept across the countryside like seasonal storms, leaving behind burned villages and displaced families. Plagues arrived without warning, wiping out entire bloodlines in a matter of weeks. Corrupt officials seized property on trumped-up charges, and bandits roamed the roads with the casual brutality that comes from knowing there are no police to call. In this world, a man could lose everything he'd ever known in the space of a single afternoon, and wake up the next morning to discover that all his previous skills, connections, and social standing had become as useful as snow in hell. These were the men who became assassins, not by choice but by elimination of every other option. They were desperate peasants who had watched their families starve while their lord feasted in his warm castle. They were disgraced soldiers who had deserted from hopeless battles or been cast out for questioning orders that made no sense. They were ex-thieves who had developed a reputation for violence that made even other criminals nervous. Men whose hands were already stained with enough blood that a little more hardly seemed to matter. They were people so far off society's radar that they could kill a man and still not be noticed in the census. Shadows that had learned to move through a world that pretended they didn't exist. The descent into this profession wasn't sudden. It was a gradual slide down a slope greased with desperation and bad decisions. Maybe you started by stealing food to feed your children, and when the local sheriff's men came looking, you had to disappear into the forest. Maybe you killed a man in self-defense, but the dead man's family had connections, and suddenly you were branded a murderer, whether the killing was justified or not. Maybe you witnessed something you shouldn't have, some noble's dark secret, and discovered that inconvenient witnesses have a tendency to suffer unfortunate accidents. Whatever the specific circumstances, the pattern was always the same. First, you lost your place in legitimate society. Then you lost your family, either to death, abandonment, or the simple necessity of keeping them safe from the consequences of your actions. Then you lost your name, your history, your entire identity, until you became nothing more than a hooded figure, skulking through back alleys with a rusty dagger and a heart full of regrets. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a goat to your name, you were in management, not field work. The world of medieval assassination was strictly blue-collar, a profession for people who had fallen so far through the cracks of society that they had landed in places where sunlight never reached. These weren't the mysterious warrior monks of Oriental legends or the romantic anti-heroes of troubadour songs. They were broken men with calloused hands and hollow eyes, people who had learned that desperation could sharpen a blade just as effectively as a whetstone, and the world seemed designed to create more of them every day. Economic systems that treated human beings like livestock, legal systems that served only the powerful, and social structures that offered no safety net for those who stumbled, meant there was always a fresh supply of men who had nothing left to lose. The medieval world was a machine for grinding people down, and assassins were what came out the other end. Damaged goods that could still perform one final service before being discarded entirely. So when someone, somewhere in the depths of some smoke-filled tavern, or the shadows of some forgotten alley, slid a coin purse across a wooden table and whispered a name, it wasn't really an opportunity they were offering. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, albeit one with razor wire wrapped around it. The name they whispered was never a fun one, either. You weren't being asked to take out Bob, the quiet turnip farmer, who minded his own business and bothered no one. It was usually a corrupt baron with a taste for other men's wives and his subjects' grain, a bishop who had accumulated enough gold to buy his own small kingdom while his flock starved, or some military commander with 12 bodyguards, a moat, and a well-deserved reputation for creative brutality. The pay was tempting, of course. It had to be, because no one would risk their life and soul for pocket change. 12 silver coins might not sound like much to modern ears, but in a world where a peasant family could live for months on that amount, it represented a fortune. It was enough money to disappear entirely, to buy passage to a distant land where no one knew your face or your history. It was enough to start over, to reinvent yourself, to become someone new. The problem was that very few assassins lived long enough to spend their earnings. But by the time someone was seriously considering taking the job, practical considerations like long-term financial planning had become luxuries they couldn't afford. When you've been sleeping in ditches and eating whatever you can steal or catch, when winter is coming and you have no shelter, no warm clothes, and no prospects, the promise of 12 silver coins starts to look like salvation itself. You don't think about the fact that you'll probably die in the attempt, or that even if you succeed, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. You think about the weight of those coins in your hand, the possibilities they represent, the brief respite they might offer from the grinding desperation that has become your constant companion. And there were no job perks to sweeten the deal. No pension plan, no health insurance, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that said, "Quiet eliminations by appointment," or advertise your services in the town square. You had to stay quiet, move fast, and never ever tell anyone what you did for a living. Especially not loudly over ale at the inn. "Oh yeah, I'm a traveling carpet seller," you'd say when people asked about your profession. "The stains? Die." The lie became as much a part of your identity as the blade you carried. Another layer of deception in a life built entirely on shadows and misdirection. Nobody dreamed of being a medieval assassin because there was nothing to dream about. No glory, no honor, no legacy that anyone would want to remember. They landed there because the world had chewed them up and spat them out, wearing a hood and holding a rusty dagger. Men who had discovered that when society abandons you completely, you might as well abandon society in return. You weren't the hero of this story, riding in to save the day with your noble quest and shining armor. You weren't even the villain, cackling maniacally as you plotted the downfall of the innocent. You were the footnote that made everyone nervous, the shadow in the corner that reminded people that civilization was thinner than they liked to believe, and that underneath all the pageantry and protocol the world was still a place where desperate men did desperate things for handfuls of silver. By the time someone considered becoming an assassin, they had already lost everything that made life worth living. No family to go home to, no future to work toward, no reputation to protect. They were ghosts walking among the living, people who had already died in every way that mattered except the physical one. And perhaps that's what made them dangerous. Not their skill with a blade or their knowledge of poisons, but their complete and utter lack of anything left to lose. When you have nothing, you can risk everything. And that kind of desperate courage was exactly what the job required. Let's burst the first myth wide open. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight in some hidden monastery with wise mentors and inspirational flute music playing softly in the background. There was no montage sequence where you progressed from fumbling amateur to deadly professional over the course of a single song. No ancient master with a long white beard teaching you the 17 secret pressure points of death while nodding sagely at your progress. No graduation ceremony where you received your official license to kill, along with a ceremonial black hood and a congratulatory scroll written in fancy calligraphy. If you learned anything at all in this profession, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. And that was a much more difficult curriculum than Hollywood would have you believe. Most medieval assassins weren't trained professionals who had spent years honing their craft in specialized schools of murder. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb quietly without sneezing at precisely the wrong moment. If you had military experience, congratulations. That meant you knew how to hold a knife properly and perhaps had some understanding of when to stick the pointy end into the other person. If you didn't have that background, well, stabbing someone turned out to be fairly intuitive from a mechanical standpoint. But escaping afterward, with both kidneys still intact and your head still attached to your shoulders, that took skill, experience, and usually just pure, dumb luck. The medieval world didn't offer correspondence courses in professional assassination or weekend workshops on advanced throat-cutting techniques. There were no manuals written by retired killers sharing their trade secrets. No guild orientation meetings where newcomers learned the proper etiquette for accepting contracts. And definitely no safety briefings about the occupational hazards of sneaking into heavily guarded castles with nothing but a rusty dagger and questionable life choices. You didn't get taught how to spot a body double, how to tell if the wine goblet had already been poisoned by someone else, or where nobles typically kept their secret escape routes. You figured all of this out while hanging from a third-story windowsill at midnight, wondering if you had just crept into the servants' quarters again, and whether that dog barking in the courtyard below had caught your scent. Learning came through trial and error, with heavy emphasis on the error part, and each mistake had the potential to be your last. Take poison, for instance. That was pure trial and error with emphasis on both words. Sometimes the concoction you'd brewed from mushrooms and herbs actually worked as intended, sending your target into peaceful, eternal sleep. Sometimes it just gave them mild indigestion and made them more suspicious of their soup. And sometimes, if you were particularly unlucky or careless, you ended up drinking the wrong cup yourself and spending your final moments contemplating the irony of being killed by your own incompetence. There was no medieval poison control hotline to call when things went wrong. Just hope, herbal guesswork, and a strong stomach for the consequences of your mistakes. The closest thing you might get to formal education was if you were extraordinarily lucky and happened to encounter someone else in the same line of work who was feeling unusually generous with their knowledge. Maybe an older assassin would take pity on you and show you how to walk across cobblestones without making that distinctive squeaking sound that alerted every guard within 50 yards to your presence. Perhaps a former thief would teach you the basics of lockpicking or explain which types of doors were most likely to creak when opened. But mentoring wasn't standard practice in this profession. It was rare, brief, and usually came with strings attached. A reason for this lack of educational opportunities was simple. Assassins didn't retire gracefully to become beloved teachers passing on their wisdom to the next generation. They disappeared, usually permanently and often violently. The life expectancy in this career was measured in months rather than years, and those who managed to survive longer than average weren't typically interested in taking on apprentices who might either betray them to the authorities or decide to eliminate the competition by murdering their instructors. So your weapons training, such as it was, consisted entirely of whatever you could figure out on your own. You weren't carrying a broadsword that required years of practice to master. You had a dagger you'd stolen off at Edgard, maybe a garrote if you were feeling fancy and had managed to get your hands on some strong wire, and whatever else you could fit under your cloak without creating suspicious bulges or making telltale jingling sounds when you moved. The art of silent killing wasn't something you learned from a master swordsman in elegant dueling chambers. It was something you developed through necessity, usually while trying to avoid being killed yourself. Success in this profession didn't come from formal training or inherited skill. It came from survival instinct and the ability to learn quickly from your mistakes, assuming you lived long enough to make any. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, sloppily, and then vanishing before anyone could get a good look at your face and tack a detailed description to the church door along with a reward notice. Every job was essentially an examination where failure meant death, and there were no makeup tests. The educational process was brutal, practical, and offered absolutely zero graduation ceremonies. Instead of diplomas, you collected bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping realization that you were very much on your own in a world that wanted you dead almost as much as you were being paid to kill others. Each successful assassination was both a victory and a reminder that your luck might not hold out for the next attempt. Your first few jobs, assuming you survived them, were exercises in pure terror disguised as professional competence. You'd spend days or even weeks casing your target's residence, trying to memorize the guards' patrol schedules, the layout of the building, the habits of the household staff, and the location of every dog that might bark at the wrong moment. You'd practice your approach over and over in your mind, planning every step from the moment you entered the grounds to your hopefully successful escape. Then, when the moment finally arrived, everything would go wrong in ways you'd never anticipated. The guard you thought was predictably drunk every night would choose that particular evening to remain sober and alert. The window you'd planned to use for entry would turn out to be latched from the inside. The corridor you'd expected to be empty would suddenly fill with servants carrying out some late-night household task you'd never observed during your surveillance. And there you'd be, crouched behind a tapestry or pressed against a wall in a shadowy alcove, trying to figure out how to salvage a plan that had already fallen apart completely. This was where you learned the most important skill of your new profession: improvisation under pressure, because in the moment when everything was going wrong and discovery seemed imminent, your ability to think quickly and adapt to changing circumstances was the only thing standing between you and a very public, very painful execution. The learning curve was steep, unforgiving, and often fatal. You discovered that sneaking through a castle at night was nothing like the daytime reconnaissance you'd conducted. Familiar corridors became confusing mazes in the darkness. Sounds carried differently, echoing off stone walls in ways that made it impossible to determine their source or distance. What had seemed like adequate hiding spots during the day revealed themselves to be pathetically inadequate when you actually needed to avoid detection. You learned that nobles didn't sleep as soundly as you'd hoped, that their chambers were often guarded by more than just the obvious sentries, and that even successful assassinations created their own problems. Killing someone, it turned out, was often the easy part. It was getting away afterward that separated the professionals from the amateurs, and even the professionals didn't always manage it. The psychological education was just as brutal as the practical one. You discovered that taking a human life, even when it was your job and your survival depended on it, did things to your mind that you hadn't anticipated. The first time you watched the light fade from someone's eyes, you realized that you'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. You were no longer the same person who had accepted that first contract, and you never would be again. Sleep became elusive, haunted by faces and voices that would never again speak or smile. Food lost its taste, companionship became impossible, and laughter felt like a betrayal of the gravity of what you'd done. You learned to live with guilt, fear, and the constant awareness that you'd become exactly the kind of person that decent society was designed to exclude and eliminate. But perhaps most importantly, you learned that survival in this profession required you to become someone else entirely. The person you'd been before, with whatever hopes, dreams, and moral principles had once guided your life, had to die just as surely as your victims did. In their place, you created a new identity built around paranoia, suspicion, and the cold calculation of risk versus reward. You learned to trust no one completely, to always have an escape plan, and to never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to form attachments that might compromise your ability to disappear at a moment's notice. This transformation wasn't taught in any classroom or guided by any mentor. It was something that happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as you adapted to the demands of your new existence. Each job hardened you a little more, made you a little less human, and a little more like the weapon you carried. It was a process of systematic dehumanization that was necessary for survival, but came at a cost that couldn't be measured in silver coins. Your education as a medieval assassin was thus complete when you finally understood that you'd traded your humanity for the skills necessary to take life efficiently and escape detection. There were no teachers to thank, no alumni associations to join, and no fond memories of your school days to cherish in your old age. There was only the knowledge that you'd learned to do something that decent people shouldn't know how to do, and that this knowledge would define the rest of your probably short, certainly isolated life. The irony was that by the time you'd acquired enough skill and experience to be genuinely good at this work, you'd also accumulated enough enemies, witnessed enough horrors, and committed enough crimes that retirement was no longer an option. You were trapped in a profession that had taught you everything except how to escape from it. Let's talk about why you became an assassin in the first place. Coin. Cold, heavy, jangly, deliciously spendable coin. The promise of it was what got you into this business. The glittering fantasy of financial freedom that made risking your life seem like a reasonable career move. But here's the thing about the medieval assassination market. You got paid in lies, broken promises, and occasionally, if you were very lucky and very careful, actual money that you might live long enough to spend. When someone hired an assassin in the 14th century, they weren't looking to establish a long-term business relationship built on mutual trust and professional respect. They wanted a one-time service with no paperwork trail, no witnesses who might later develop inconvenient memories, and ideally no surviving contractors who could be traced back to them if things went wrong. The entire transaction was designed from the beginning to leave you holding the short end of a very sharp stick. The standard offer sounded reasonable enough on the surface. They'd promise you a pouch of silver, half now and half when the job was completed. That seemed fair, even generous, especially when you were desperate enough to consider murder as a viable career option. The problem was understanding what "when the job is done" actually meant in practice. To you, it meant after you'd successfully eliminated the target. To your employer, it meant after they'd verified that you hadn't messed up the assignment, hadn't made them look bad, hadn't left a trail that could lead back to their door, and most importantly, hadn't survived long enough to tell anyone about the arrangement. The mathematics of medieval contract killing were brutally simple. A dead assassin couldn't demand payment, couldn't reveal embarrassing details about who had hired them, and couldn't decide to branch out into the lucrative field of blackmail. A knife to the gut was significantly cheaper than a bonus payment, and it solved multiple problems simultaneously. Even when clients had every intention of honoring their agreements, circumstances had a way of changing their minds between the initial handshake and the final settlement. So you'd take the job, accepting the advance payment with the naive belief that honor among thieves was more than just a poetic expression. You'd spend weeks planning the approach, studying your target's habits, bribing servants for information about household routines, and mapping out escape routes that would allow you to collect your final payment and disappear into whatever passed for witness protection in an age before such programs existed. Then came the execution phase, and that's where things typically started going sideways. You'd sneak through shadows that seemed too thin to hide anyone, risk your life navigating castle defenses that were specifically designed to kill people like you, and maybe if luck and skill combined in just the right proportions, you'd manage to kill a baron in his sleep. It was never pretty or poetic, just a brief, violent moment in the darkness followed by the immediate need to escape before someone discovered the body and raised the alarm. When you finally returned to collect your payment, assuming you'd managed to survive the job and evade capture during your escape, that's when you'd discover the true nature of medieval business ethics. Ah, yes, about that payment. Your client would say with the kind of apologetic expression that immediately told you everything you needed to know. Terribly sorry, but there have been some complications. Maybe they'd claim that the heat from the investigation made it too dangerous to meet. Perhaps they'd argue that your methods had been too messy, too public, too likely to attract unwanted attention. Or they might simply inform you that they'd had to leave town suddenly on urgent business and couldn't be reached for the foreseeable future. The worst-case scenario, which happened more often than anyone in the profession cared to admit, was when your former client tried to tie up loose ends by arranging for your own assassination. Nothing said, "Thanks for your professional service," quite like discovering that someone had put a price on your head immediately after you'd completed their contract. It was a particularly cruel form of cost-benefit analysis. Why pay someone when you could have them killed for less money and greater security? Even when clients actually intended to pay you, the amount was never quite enough to justify the risks you'd taken. Not for the weeks of surveillance, not for the blood on your hands, not for the 3 days you'd spent hiding in a haystack with fleas, moral regret, and the growing certainty that you'd chosen the wrong profession entirely. You'd get a handful of coins, a curt nod of acknowledgement, and a reminder that as far as the world was concerned, you had never existed and this conversation had never taken place. Some contracts turned out to be elaborate political traps designed to eliminate inconvenient witnesses or potential rivals. You'd be hired to assassinate someone dangerous, only to discover upon arrival that it was a setup involving decoy targets, hidden guards, and law enforcement officials who'd been expecting you all along. Congratulations, you just walked into a medieval sting operation, with your name already carved on a gallows that was probably being constructed while you were still approaching your target's residence. These fake contracts were particularly insidious because they were often indistinguishable from legitimate jobs until the moment everything went wrong. The advance payment was real, the target information seemed authentic, and the client displayed all the appropriate signs of nervousness and secrecy that you'd learned to expect from people arranging murders. It was only when you found yourself surrounded by armed men who seemed remarkably well informed about your approach route that you realized you'd been played by someone much cleverer than yourself. Even when the deal was genuine and the client had every intention of following through on their promises, you couldn't exactly take them to court if they decided to welch on the agreement. Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract wasn't the kind of legal argument that medieval jurisprudence was designed to handle. The only court you were likely to see was the one where you'd be serving as the primary exhibit in a public execution designed to demonstrate the fate that awaited those who thought they could profit from murder. The illegality of your profession meant that you had no recourse when clients decided to cheat you. There were no professional organizations to file complaints with, no better business bureaus to report fraudulent contractors to, and no labor unions to negotiate on behalf of exploited assassins. You were completely at the mercy of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to arrange murders, which suggested that their commitment to fair dealing might be somewhat limited. This lack of legal protection meant that successful assassins quickly learned to demand payment in advance whenever possible. Unfortunately, clients who were willing to pay the full amount up front were often the ones running the most dangerous scams. Legitimate employers wanted to maintain some leverage over their hired killers, so they insisted on the traditional half-now, half-later arrangement. It was the people planning to betray you who were most willing to pay the entire fee immediately, secure in the knowledge that they'd be getting their money back along with your life. The economics of the profession created a vicious cycle that was almost impossible to escape. Each job made you more valuable as a target for elimination, since successful assassins represented ongoing security risks to their former clients. But each job also made you more desperate for the next payday, since the irregular income and high expenses of maintaining false identities meant that you were always just one missed contract away from starvation. The few assassins who managed to accumulate any significant wealth faced the additional problem of having nowhere safe to keep it. Medieval banking was primitive at best, and assassins weren't exactly the kind of customers that respectable moneylenders wanted to do business with. You couldn't buy property under your real name, since your real name was probably associated with multiple outstanding warrants. You couldn't invest in legitimate businesses, since that would require maintaining a stable identity and location for extended periods. So you learned to take whatever payment you could get, demand as much as possible in advance, and trust absolutely no one, including the greasy little scribes who swore that this job would change your life forever. They weren't lying about that last part. It would indeed change your life, mostly by shortening it considerably and filling whatever time remained with paranoia, guilt, and the constant need to look over your shoulder for signs of pursuit. The bitter irony was that the skills you developed as an assassin made you increasingly unemployable in any legitimate profession. Potential employers tended to be nervous around people who specialized in solving problems through violence, especially when those people couldn't provide verifiable references from their previous work experience. Your resume had some significant gaps that couldn't be explained without admitting to activities that would result in immediate arrest and execution. Being paid in lies and broken promises became the norm rather than the exception. It was just another occupational hazard in a career that was already overflowing with them. You learned to view each successful payment as a minor miracle rather than a professional entitlement, and you developed the survival skills necessary to function in an economy where your employers had every incentive to kill you rather than pay you. The most successful assassins, the ones who managed to complete multiple contracts and live to tell about it, became experts at disappearing immediately after completing their work. They didn't wait around for payment ceremonies or thank you notes. They took whatever advance money they'd been given, completed the job as quickly and quietly as possible, and then vanished before their clients had time to organize any unpleasant surprises. This approach meant giving up a significant portion of the promised payment, but it also meant living long enough to potentially earn money from future contracts. It was a harsh lesson in the economics of survival. Sometimes the money you didn't collect was worth more than the money you did, especially when collecting it might cost you everything you'd ever earn again. So, you've taken the job, you've been lied to about the pay, and you're probably going to die. Now let's talk about your equipment, because this is where the gap between fantasy and reality becomes a chasm wide enough to swallow entire armies of disappointed romantics. Forget the fantasy novels with their retractable wrist blades that deploy with satisfying mechanical clicks. Dismiss the sneaky video games where assassins carry enough concealed weapons to outfit a small militia. Put aside any dreams of enchanted daggers that glow in the presence of evil, or crossbows that fold neatly into your boot like some kind of medieval Swiss Army knife. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a tattered cloak without creating suspicious bulges or making sounds that would alert every guard within 100 yards to your presence. If you were extraordinarily lucky, and by lucky, I mean you'd found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe while also avoiding being struck by lightning on the same day, you might possess what could generously be called a good dagger. This wasn't some ornate ceremonial blade with a curved edge like a dragon's tooth and a pommel encrusted with precious gems. It was just a piece of sharpened metal, hopefully free of rust, and ideally one that didn't still carry the distinctive odor of the last person you'd used it on. The reality of medieval metallurgy meant that even the best weapons available to someone in your position were far from perfect. Steel was expensive. Good steel was extraordinarily expensive, and the kind of perfectly balanced, razor-sharp implements that modern fiction associates with professional killers were simply beyond the reach of desperate criminals operating on tight budgets. Your dagger was more likely to be made from iron that had been worked by a blacksmith who was either drunk, incompetent, or working with inferior materials. It might hold an edge for a while, but it was just as likely to chip, bend, or break at precisely the moment when your life depended on its reliability. Poison existed, certainly, but it wasn't the elegant, sophisticated substance that stories made it out to be. Medieval toxicology was less science than hopeful experimentation, a field where the difference between effective dose and lethal dose was often determined through trial and error that left a trail of bodies in its wake. Most poisons available to someone in your circumstances were unpredictable concoctions made from plants, minerals, or animal parts that had been ground up according to recipes passed down through word of mouth by people who probably hadn't survived to verify their effectiveness. Some worked instantly, dropping the victim in convulsions before they could even cry out for help. Others took hours to take effect, during which time your target might realize they'd been poisoned and spend their remaining time organizing a manhunt that would make your life considerably shorter and much more unpleasant. Some made victims violently ill for days before finally killing them, which was problematic both because it gave them time to identify you as the source of their distress, and because watching someone die slowly from poison tended to attract exactly the kind of attention that assassins preferred to avoid. The worst-case scenario was poison that simply didn't work as advertised. Your target might vomit spectacularly for a day or two and then recover, angry and now very suspicious of anyone who'd been near their food or drink recently. They might develop a painful rash or lose their hair, symptoms that were certainly unpleasant but hardly fatal. In some cases, the poison might actually make them feel better, functioning as an accidental cure for some other ailment that they'd been suffering from, which was awkward for everyone involved. Ropes were occasionally useful for strangling, climbing, or tying people up, but only if you actually knew how to use them effectively. There's nothing quite like trying to strangle someone while simultaneously trying to remember which knot goes under what, and muttering, "Wait, which knot goes under again?" while your intended victim struggles and makes increasingly loud noises that are likely to attract unwanted attention. Rope was also bulky, difficult to conceal, and had an annoying tendency to get tangled at exactly the wrong moment. Bows and crossbows were effective weapons in the hands of trained marksmen, but they came with their own set of problems. First, you had to actually possess one, which wasn't easy when most decent ranged weapons were expensive and closely regulated by local authorities, who preferred that only their own soldiers be well armed. Second, you had to know how to use it accurately, which required practice that was difficult to obtain when you couldn't exactly set up target practice in the town square. Third, you had to smuggle it into position, which was challenging when most palaces and castles had security measures specifically designed to prevent people from bringing weapons into the presence of important personages. Most assassinations were necessarily up-close and personal affairs. There wasn't time for elegant marksmanship or carefully calculated shots from concealed positions. You needed to get within arm's reach of your target, do the deed quickly and quietly, and escape before anyone realized what had happened. This meant that your weapon of choice had to be something that could be concealed easily, deployed rapidly, and used effectively in close quarters, preferably without requiring extensive training or perfect environmental conditions. The other problem with your equipment was that you didn't get backup weapons or replacement parts. If your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well during a particularly athletic escape attempt, you were suddenly in the market for creative alternatives. Slate roof tiles could function as crude throwing weapons if you were desperate enough. A rusty nail might serve as an improvised dagger if properly sharpened and wielded with sufficient determination. Even a shoe buckle could become a weapon if you had enough intent and very low standards for what constituted adequate armament. You carried your tools hidden in the hems of your clothing, stuffed into your boots, or concealed inside hollowed-out loaves of bread if the situation demanded truly creative concealment methods. Everything had to be kept close at hand, not for safety or convenience, but because in this line of work, your weapon was simultaneously your best friend, your immediate supervisor, and your only realistic retirement plan. There were no equipment upgrades between missions, no opportunities for shopping at the medieval equivalent of a weapons store, and definitely no technical support when something broke down. The maintenance of your equipment was entirely your responsibility, and it had to be done under conditions that were far from ideal. You couldn't exactly take your dagger to the local blacksmith for professional sharpening, since explaining why you needed a knife that could slice through flesh with minimal effort might raise uncomfortable questions. Instead, you learned to maintain your weapons using whatever stones or files you could find, working by candlelight in whatever hiding place you'd managed to secure for the night, always listening for sounds that might indicate discovery and arrest. You didn't polish your equipment because it looked nice or because you took professional pride in maintaining quality tools. You kept your weapons in working condition because your life literally depended on their reliability. A dull blade meant a messy kill, which meant more noise, more blood, and a much higher chance of being caught. A rusty garrote might snap under pressure, leaving you to explain to a very angry and very much alive target why you just tried to strangle them with what appeared to be a piece of old wire. The psychological relationship between an assassin and his tools was unlike anything experienced by practitioners of legitimate trades. A carpenter's hammer might be important to his work, but it wasn't the difference between eating dinner and becoming dinner. A soldier's sword was certainly crucial in battle, but soldiers typically had backup weapons, armor for protection, and comrades to assist them if something went wrong. You had only what you could carry, conceal, and maintain, entirely on your own. This created a kind of paranoid intimacy with your equipment that bordered on the obsessive. You knew exactly how your dagger felt in your hand, how much pressure was required to deploy it silently, and precisely what angle of attack would be most effective against different types of clothing and armor. You understood the particular sounds that different weapons made when striking various materials. Knowledge that could mean the difference between a silent kill and an alarm that would bring every guard in the castle running to investigate. The scarcity and unreliability of proper equipment also meant that successful assassins became remarkably creative in their approach to problem solving. When you couldn't rely on having the perfect tool for every situation, you learned to adapt whatever was available to meet your immediate needs. A eating knife could become a throwing weapon, a belt could be converted into a garrote, and almost any heavy object could serve as a bludgeon if the circumstances demanded it. This improvisation wasn't born from creativity or artistic expression. It was pure survival instinct, adapted to the reality of working with substandard equipment in hostile environments. You learned to see potential weapons everywhere because you never knew when your primary tools might fail, be lost, or prove inadequate for the specific challenges of a particular job. Every object in your environment was evaluated not just for its intended purpose, but for its potential utility in ending someone's life quickly and quietly. The irony was that this constant adaptation and improvisation actually made you more dangerous than someone who relied entirely on specialized equipment. When you'd learn to kill effectively with whatever happened to be available, the loss of a particular weapon became an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. You developed a kind of resourcefulness that was born from desperation, but evolved into a genuine skill that could be applied to almost any situation. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you, alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with whatever implements you could steal, sharpen, or improvise from the materials at hand. Your true weapon wasn't the dagger or the poison or the rope. It was your desperation, your willingness to do what others wouldn't, and your ability to adapt to circumstances that would paralyze someone who expected to have the right tool for every job. Assassins weren't hired to take out random drunks in back alleys or settle scores with unpopular merchants who charged too much for bread. No one paid you good money to eliminate Jeff the sleepy candle maker or dispose of that irritating beggar who always positioned himself outside the church on Sunday mornings. Your targets were important people, the kind who mattered in the grand scheme of medieval politics and economics. Nobles with hereditary titles and vast estates, bishops who controlled both spiritual and temporal power, military officers whose tactical decisions could determine the outcome of wars, and sometimes even royalty whose continued existence posed inconvenient obstacles to someone else's ambitions. These people were very, very hard to kill, and that difficulty wasn't accidental. They'd spent their entire lives accumulating not just wealth and power, but the security apparatus necessary to protect both. When you're born into the upper echelons of medieval society, you don't just inherit land and titles. You inherit enemies, rivals, and the kind of paranoia that keeps you alive long enough to pass those same advantages on to your children. First, there were the guards, and not just one or two sleepy sentries who could be easily distracted or bribed. Important nobles maintained private armies of professional soldiers whose entire job was keeping their employer breathing. These weren't part-time militia members or hastily recruited peasants. They were career warriors who had been selected for their skill, loyalty, and willingness to kill anyone who posed a threat to their lord. Some guarded the front entrances with weapons drawn and eyes constantly scanning for approaching danger. Others patrolled the rear approaches, the side passages, the gardens, and any other route that might provide access to the property. Still more guards were positioned throughout the interior of the residence, stationed at key choke points like staircases, doorways, and corridors that led to the private chambers where their employer slept, ate, and conducted business. Some of these interior guards appeared to be doing other things entirely, masquerading as servants or courtiers while remaining constantly alert for signs of trouble. They might be polishing armor that was already spotless, or engaging in seemingly casual conversation while their hands rested on the hilts of their weapons, and their attention remained focused on everyone who entered their field of vision. You would spend days, sometimes weeks, memorizing patrol patterns that had been deliberately designed to be unpredictable. Guards would change shifts at irregular intervals, walk routes that varied from day to day, and communicate with each other using signals that you couldn't decipher from a distance. You'd count exactly how many stairs it took before the night watch captain with the chronic cough needed to pause for breath, not out of casual interest, but because that 3-second wheeze might represent your only opportunity to slip past his position undetected. Second, there were the physical defenses, and medieval fortress architecture had been refined over centuries specifically to make unauthorized entry as difficult as possible. Castles didn't have welcoming front porches or convenient ground floor windows. They featured gatehouse with multiple layers of security, murder holes designed to rain death down on anyone attempting to force entry, and moats filled with water that was not only deep enough to drown in, but often contaminated with waste, debris, and occasionally things that bite. If you managed to avoid falling into the water, you still had to worry about arrow slits cut into the walls at strategic intervals, manned by archers whose job was to kill anyone approaching the fortification with obvious hostile intent. These weren't warning shots or intimidation tactics. They were lethal force applied without hesitation or mercy. The arrows were designed to penetrate armor and flesh with equal efficiency, and the archers who fired them had spent years perfecting their accuracy under exactly these kinds of combat conditions. And there was the boiling oil, because medieval defenders believed in making their point with emphasis. Your job description, such as it was, included the very real possibility of being flambéed for the crime of attempting to peek through the wrong window or climb the wrong section of wall. The oil wasn't just hot, it was specifically heated to temperatures that would cause immediate, excruciating, and often fatal burns. It stuck to skin and clothing, continuing to burn long after the initial contact, and it was applied liberally to anyone foolish enough to present themselves as a target. Third, there were the servants and household staff, an often overlooked component of the security system that could be more dangerous than armed guards, precisely because they appeared harmless. Cooks, scribes, stable boys, laundresses, and gardeners all had legitimate reasons to be present throughout the residence at all hours of the day and night. They knew the normal rhythms of household life with the kind of intimate familiarity that comes from daily repetition, which meant they could spot irregularities immediately. One wrong look from you, one gesture that seemed out of place, one word spoken with the wrong accent. And these seemingly innocent servants would be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could fabricate an explanation for your presence. Medieval servants understood that their continued employment, and often their continued existence, depended on maintaining their employer's security. They had strong incentives to report anything unusual, and they possessed the kind of detailed knowledge about household routines that made them extremely effective at detecting infiltration attempts. Assassins weren't just fighting against swords and armor, they were fighting against an entire network of human intelligence that operated on the principle that everyone was potentially dangerous until proven otherwise. These servants had been selected not just for their professional skills, but for their loyalty and discretion. They understood that loose tongues and careless observations could result in their employer's death, which would likely be followed by their own execution as either accomplices or security failures. Medieval gossip traveled at the speed of light when it involved potential threats to powerful people. And everyone from the kitchen staff to the stable hands understood that being the first to report suspicious activity could mean the difference between a reward and a grave. Servants who demonstrated exceptional vigilance might be promoted to positions of greater trust and responsibility. Those who failed to notice obvious threats would find themselves looking for new employment, assuming they survived the consequences of their oversight. Fourth, there was your actual target, who had not survived long enough to accumulate power and wealth by being careless about personal security. These people were professionally paranoid, and rightfully so. They lived in a world where they were surrounded by relatives with claims to their titles, political rivals who would benefit from their deaths, and subordinates who might be tempted to advance their own careers through strategic assassinations. They didn't eat food without having it tested first, often by multiple people whose job was to die instead of them if poison was present. They didn't sleep in the same bed every night, rotating between different chambers according to schedules that were known only to their most trusted security personnel. Some maintained decoy bedrooms where elaborately arranged pillows and blankets created the illusion of an occupied bed, while the actual occupant slept elsewhere under heavy guard. Their daily routines were deliberately unpredictable, designed to prevent exactly the kind of pattern analysis that you needed to plan a successful assassination. They might take their meals at different times each day, conduct business in various locations throughout their residence, and travel between rooms using routes that changed according to security protocols you couldn't anticipate or decipher. And don't get excited if you heard rumors that your target would be attending a public feast or ceremony. Yes, they might be somewhat more relaxed in a social setting, and alcohol might dull their reflexes and judgment to some degree, but they would still be surrounded by personal guards who remain sober and alert regardless of the festive atmosphere. You would still have to get past royal security, 3 hunting dogs trained to detect intruders, a jester whose job included watching the crowd for suspicious behavior, and 50 witnesses holding tankards who would remember your face for the rest of their lives if you did anything memorable. Even getting close to your target could require weeks of preparation that felt more like an elaborate intelligence operation than a simple murder plot. You might need to pose as a servant, which meant learning enough about household operations to avoid immediate detection. You might need to bribe a chambermaid, which required not only money you probably didn't have, but also the ability to identify staff members who were corrupt enough to accept bribes, but not so corrupt that they would take your money and immediately report you to the authorities. You might need to hide in barrels, under carts, or inside laundry bundles, remaining motionless for hours while trying not to sneeze, cough, or make any sound that would reveal your presence to the dozens of people moving around the area where you were concealed. You had to time your movements to coincide with household activities that would mask any noise you might make, while also avoiding the normal traffic patterns that would bring staff members directly to your hiding place. When the critical moment finally arrived, after all the planning, surveillance, bribery, and preparation, you had exactly one opportunity to complete your mission successfully. One precise, perfect, silent, bloodless ghost vanish in the night moment when everything had to go exactly right. The slightest mistake, the smallest miscalculation, the tiniest bit of bad luck, and you would transform from an invisible threat into a very visible, very captured, very dead problem. There were no second chances, no opportunities to explain that your blade had slipped, or that you'd been aiming for someone else entirely. There were no timeout periods during which you could regroup and try a different approach. You either succeeded completely and escaped without detection, or you became the next cautionary example, swinging from the castle gate with a sign that read, "Nice try, but not quite good enough," serving as a warning to anyone else who might be considering a similar career change. This was the reality of hunting the untouchable. They were untouchable for very good reasons that had been developed over centuries of trial and error by people whose survival depended on staying ahead of people exactly like you. Let's be honest about something that fantasy literature and modern entertainment have gotten completely wrong. When you picture a medieval assassin in your mind, you probably imagine sleek black robes that somehow never get dirty despite crawling through sewers and climbing castle walls. You envision leather bracers that serve no practical purpose but look intimidating in torchlight. Maybe you see a mysterious hood that billows dramatically in the moonlight while somehow never obscuring the wearer's vision at exactly the wrong moment. You might even imagine a form-fitting outfit that manages to be both completely concealing and remarkably flattering, like something designed by a costume department with unlimited budget and no understanding of historical reality. The truth was considerably less photogenic. You looked like a sick goat herder with something to hide, because that's essentially what you were. Disguises in the medieval world weren't exactly high fashion, and they certainly weren't designed with aesthetic appeal in mind. You didn't have access to custom-tailored cloaks or retractable armor that could transform you from peasant to nobleman with the pull of a hidden lever. You had whatever clothing you could scavenge, steal, or improvise from materials that nobody else wanted badly enough to guard. Medieval disguises were fundamentally about blending in with a population that hadn't bathed in weeks, limped from old injuries, and displayed the kind of nervous twitches that came from chronic malnutrition and constant fear of violence. The goal wasn't to look mysterious or intimidating. It was to become so utterly unremarkable that you could stand in plain sight without attracting even casual attention. You wanted to achieve the kind of invisibility that came from being exactly as miserable and desperate as everyone else around you. Peasant rags were your most common disguise, partly because they were easy to obtain and partly because they represented the default appearance of most people in medieval society. These weren't quaint rustic garments with charming patches and folksy embroidery. They were genuinely filthy, frequently torn, and often infested with parasites that had taken up permanent residence in the fabric. The authenticity of your disguise could literally be measured by how many different types of insects were sharing your clothing, because cleanliness was a luxury that actual peasants couldn't afford. A monk's robe was another popular option, assuming you could get your hands on one that wasn't being actively worn by someone who might object to having it stolen. These garments had the advantage of covering your entire body while also providing a legitimate excuse for keeping your face partially hidden beneath a hood. The downside was that monks were expected to know things like prayers, religious protocols, and Latin phrases that could identify you as a fraud if you encountered anyone with actual theological training. Monks also had distinctive ways of moving, speaking, and carrying themselves that came from years of religious discipline and communal living. You might be able to fool casual observers from a distance, but any extended interaction with people who knew what monks were supposed to look and act like would quickly expose you as an imposter. And being caught impersonating a member of the clergy was the kind of offense that medieval justice systems took very seriously, often with punishments that involved creative applications of fire. If you were particularly desperate or the situation demanded it, you might try to pass yourself off as a guard using a uniform that definitely still smelled like its previous owner. This disguise had obvious advantages in terms of providing access to restricted areas, but it came with the significant disadvantage of requiring you to actually know how to act like a guard. Real guards had specific duties, patrol routes, and procedures that they followed with military precision. They knew the names of their fellow guards, the locations of important rooms and passages, and the protocols for dealing with various types of security situations. You, on the other hand, had acquired your uniform through methods that probably involved the previous owner being in no condition to provide helpful guidance about proper guard behavior. This meant you had to improvise your way through interactions with people who would immediately recognize that you didn't belong if you made even small mistakes about things that any legitimate guard would know instinctively. The fundamental problem with medieval disguises was that you were trying to blend in with communities where everyone knew everyone else, often going back multiple generations. In a world without photographs, newspapers, or any form of mass media, people relied on personal recognition and word-of-mouth information to identify friends, enemies, and potential threats. Strangers were immediately noticeable precisely because they were strange, and any unfamiliar face was automatically suspect until proven otherwise. Servants in noble households were particularly dangerous to assassins attempting to use disguises because they had intimate knowledge of everyone who belonged in their workplace. They knew which guards were assigned to which shifts, which monks were authorized to enter the premises, and which merchants were expected to make deliveries on any given day. They could spot an imposter immediately, not through any special training or sophisticated detection methods, but simply because they knew you weren't supposed to be there. If anyone asked who you were, and they would ask because medieval society operated on the assumption that everyone needed to account for their presence at all times, you had to think fast and provide answers that would satisfy their curiosity without raising additional questions. I'm Brother Tobias. I take care of silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Might work if you were lucky. And the person asking wasn't particularly well informed about monastic practices. But it might also result in follow-up questions about which monastery you came from, who your abbot was, and why your hands didn't have the calluses that would be expected from someone who spent their days doing manual labor. You were always one I've never seen you before, comment away from being clubbed with a candlestick by someone whose job was to maintain household security. And if your disguise did manage to fool the casual observers, congratulations! You now had to stay in character for hours, while pretending not to notice all the very stab-worthy people wandering around within easy reach of your concealed weapons. Maintaining a false identity required constant attention to details that most people took for granted. How you walked, how you held your shoulders, how you responded to casual greetings, and how you reacted to unexpected questions. The physical limitations of medieval disguise technology created additional problems that modern audiences rarely consider. Wigs didn't exist, at least not in any form that would be useful to someone trying to quickly change their appearance. If you needed to look older or younger, you were stuck with smearing dirt on your face, squinting to create the appearance of wrinkles, and hoping that no one got close enough to notice that your beard was glued on with honey, tree sap, or whatever other adhesive you could improvise from available materials. Changing your apparent height was essentially impossible without stilts, which were impractical for obvious reasons. Altering your build required bulky padding that created its own problems with mobility and concealment. And forget about changing your race or ethnicity in any convincing way. The makeup techniques and materials that would be required simply didn't exist, and attempting such a transformation would likely result in something that was more obviously fake than wearing no disguise at all. This meant that your disguise options were limited to variations on your actual appearance, modified by whatever clothing, dirt, and minor props you could acquire. You might be able to transform yourself from suspicious stranger with a weapon to slightly less suspicious stranger with a concealed weapon, but you weren't going to achieve anything like the dramatic identity changes that modern entertainment associates with master disguise artists. The psychological challenge of maintaining a disguise was often more difficult than the physical aspects. You had to suppress your natural reactions to stress, danger, and the constant awareness that discovery meant immediate death. You couldn't flinch when guards walked past, couldn't look away guiltily when someone made eye contact, and couldn't display any of the nervous behaviors that would suggest you had something to hide. At the same time, you had to remain constantly alert for opportunities to complete your mission while appearing to be focused entirely on whatever role you were supposed to be playing. You had to notice the movements of your target, identify potential witnesses, and plan your escape route while simultaneously pretending to be absorbed in mundane tasks like sweeping floors, carrying water, or standing guard over empty corridors. This divided attention was exhausting in ways that physical exertion never was. You were essentially running multiple complex programs in your brain simultaneously: the conscious performance of your assumed identity, the subconscious monitoring of your environment for threats and opportunities, and the constant calculation of risks and contingencies that might determine whether you lived or died in the next few minutes. The social isolation that came with using disguises was another aspect of the profession that took a psychological toll over time. You couldn't form genuine connections with the people around you because every interaction was based on lies and manipulation. You couldn't relax your guard or allow yourself to enjoy casual conversation because you never knew when someone might ask a question that would expose your true identity and purpose. Even successful disguises created their own problems because they often worked too well. If you convinced people that you were actually a monk, a guard, or a servant, they would expect you to continue performing those duties indefinitely. You might find yourself assigned to tasks that kept you away from your target, or given responsibilities that required knowledge and skills you didn't possess. Extricating yourself from these situations without arousing suspicion required careful planning and often involved creating additional complications that made your mission more difficult. The truth was that your disguise didn't really protect you in any meaningful way. At best, it gave you maybe 5 minutes of confusion when someone first encountered you, a brief window during which they tried to figure out who you were and why you were there. After that initial moment of uncertainty, you had to either complete your mission and disappear, find a way to become genuinely invisible, or be so convincing in your assumed role that people stopped questioning your presence entirely. And if anyone saw through your disguise, well, there was really no recovering from that kind of exposure. You couldn't explain away being caught in the bishop's private chambers wearing a nun's habit while holding a sword, especially not on a feast day when there were dozens of witnesses and no plausible innocent explanation for your presence. The best you could hope for in such situations was a quick death, because being taken alive meant interrogation, torture, and eventual execution after you'd been forced to reveal everything you knew about who had hired you and why. This constant vulnerability meant that every moment spent in disguise was a gamble with stakes that couldn't be higher. You were betting your life on your ability to maintain a performance that had to be flawless, sustained, and convincing enough to fool people whose lives depended on their ability to detect exactly the kind of threats you represented. It was method acting where the slightest mistake in character development would result in a very real, very final curtain call. The irony was that the more successful you became at using disguises, the more isolated you became from any kind of authentic human interaction. You spent so much time pretending to be other people that you gradually lost touch with whoever you had been before you started down this path. Your real personality became just another disguise, something you put on when the situation required it, rather than a genuine expression of your identity and values. So you did it. The plan worked. The dagger struck true. No screams, no guards running toward the sound of struggle. Just a clean drop to the floor and a very important person who was now significantly less important than they had been 30 seconds earlier. Congratulations on completing your first successful assassination. Now run for your life. Because being a successful medieval assassin didn't mean you got to sip wine on a rooftop while the city burned romantically in the background. It meant fleeing through back alleys with someone else's blood on your boots, and the growing certainty that every dog in the city had already caught your scent and was leading an increasingly large mob of very angry people directly to your location. There was no victory lap after a successful kill, no post-job drink with colleagues who understood the unique stresses of your profession, and definitely no casual debrief with your client where you compared notes about how smoothly everything had gone. You didn't even get a moment to admire your handiwork or feel satisfied about the precision of your blade work. The moment your weapon struck its target, your job description immediately changed from eliminate this specific person to escape everyone who now wants to murder you in increasingly creative and public ways. The aftermath of a successful assassination was like being dropped into the center of a hornet's nest while covered in honey and wearing a sign that read, "Please sting me." Guards would be mobilized within minutes, not just the household security that had failed to prevent the killing, but every available soldier, militiaman, and armed citizen who could be rapidly organized into search parties. Doors that had been open would suddenly be locked and barred. Horses that might have provided rapid escape would be secured or moved to locations where you couldn't access them. And every exit from the city would be watched by people whose instructions were to kill first and ask questions later. You probably weren't in the best physical condition for a marathon escape attempt either. Successful assassinations, even perfectly executed ones, tend to be physically and emotionally exhausting experiences. Your heart would be pounding from adrenaline. Your hands might be shaking from the stress of the kill, and you might be bleeding from minor wounds sustained during your infiltration or escape from the immediate scene. This wasn't the ideal state for outrunning professional soldiers who were fresh, well-equipped, and highly motivated to capture you alive, so they could make an example of what happened to people who murdered their employers. The window for escape was brutally small, measured in minutes rather than hours, and it was shrinking with every second that passed after your target's body was discovered. You had to plan your exit strategy before you ever made the kill, mapping out multiple routes that would take you away from the scene as quickly as possible, while avoiding the main roads and obvious paths that searchers would check first. This meant knowing the local geography with the kind of intimate detail that usually took months or years to develop. Understanding which alleys led to dead ends, which buildings had roofs that could support your weight, and which areas of the city were most likely to offer temporary shelter. Your escape routes had to account for a dozen different variables that could change without warning. The weather could turn bad, making roads impassable, or providing cover that might help or hinder your flight. Local events, like market days or religious festivals, could flood certain areas with crowds that would either hide you or trap you, depending on how the situation developed. Construction projects, accidents, or random street closures could force you to abandon carefully planned routes and improvise alternatives while people were actively hunting for you. The psychological pressure of being hunted was unlike anything else you might have experienced in your previous life. Assuming you'd had one before circumstances forced you into this profession. Every shadow could be hiding a bard, every sound might indicate pursuit, and every person you encountered was potentially someone who could identify you as the fugitive everyone was looking for. You couldn't trust anyone, couldn't ask for help, and couldn't stop moving long enough to properly assess your injuries or plan your next move. This paranoia wasn't irrational. It was a realistic response to the fact that everyone in the city now had strong incentives to capture or kill you. The authorities would be offering rewards for information, leading to your arrest. And those rewards would be substantial enough to tempt even people who might otherwise be sympathetic to your situation. Your description would be circulated to every guard post, market square, and tavern in the area, often accompanied by crude sketches that might or might not resemble you, but would definitely make everyone more suspicious of strangers. The city would go into lockdown mode within hours of the assassination, assuming the victim was important enough to warrant that level of response, which they usually were, since unimportant people didn't typically attract professional killers. Gates would be closed and heavily guarded, preventing anyone from leaving without proper authorization and documentation that you obviously didn't possess. Checkpoints would be established at key intersections and bridges, staffed by guards who had been given your description and instructions to detain anyone who seemed suspicious or couldn't adequately explain their presence in the area. Even if you managed to evade the immediate search efforts and escape the city, your problems were just beginning. Word of the assassination would spread rapidly to neighboring communities, carried by messengers who traveled faster than you could on foot and had access to fresh horses at way stations along the major roads. Your description would precede you to every town and village in the region, making it dangerous to seek shelter, food, or supplies from anyone who might recognize you as a wanted fugitive. This meant you had to become entirely self-sufficient at exactly the moment when you were least equipped to take care of yourself. You needed to find food without entering markets or interacting with vendors who might remember your face. You had to locate shelter without approaching inns, monasteries, or private homes where you might be recognized. You required medical attention for any injuries sustained during your escape, but you couldn't seek help from physicians, barber surgeons, or anyone else who might ask uncomfortable questions about how you'd been hurt. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of successful assassination to endure. You were completely cut off from any form of human contact that wasn't potentially deadly, unable to trust anyone with even basic information about who you were or where you were going. Every conversation had to be carefully calculated to avoid revealing anything that might connect you to the crime, while also gathering information that might help you stay ahead of your pursuers. You couldn't write letters to anyone you'd known in your previous life, couldn't send messages to family members who might be worried about your disappearance, and couldn't maintain any of the social connections that had once given your life meaning and structure. You had to assume that everyone from your past was either dead, unreachable, or had already been contacted by the authorities who were trying to track your movements by interviewing anyone who might know where you'd go or who might help you. The financial aspect of your escape was another source of constant stress. Successful assassinations usually meant you'd collected at least part of your fee, assuming your client had honored their agreement and hadn't tried to kill you immediately after you completed the job. But that money had to last for an indefinite period during which you couldn't earn additional income through any legitimate means. You had to pay for food, shelter, transportation, and supplies without drawing attention to yourself or spending in ways that might be remembered by merchants or innkeepers. This often meant choosing between necessities that all seemed equally important. You could buy better food, but that might require interacting with people who would remember a customer willing to pay premium prices for quality meals. You could purchase a horse for faster travel, but horses required documentation, ongoing care, and explanations about how you'd acquired such valuable property. You could stay in better accommodations, but nicer inns kept records of their guests and attracted the kind of attention from local authorities that you desperately needed to avoid. The constant need to make these kinds of trade-offs between safety, comfort, and mobility was mentally exhausting in ways that the actual assassination had never been. The kill itself might have taken only minutes to complete, but the aftermath could last for months or years, a prolonged period of stress and uncertainty that slowly ground down your mental and physical health. Your client, assuming they had actually planned to pay you the remainder of your fee, wasn't going to meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a thank you note expressing their appreciation for your professional service. They would probably disappear as well, either because they were genuinely afraid of being connected to the crime, or because they had always planned to eliminate you as a security risk once the job was completed. The most dangerous person in the world, from their perspective, was an assassin who had just demonstrated their ability to penetrate security systems and eliminate protected targets. This meant that even when you succeeded in completing your mission exactly as specified, you walked away with a handful of coins in one hand and a giant target painted on your back. You had proven your competence in the most dramatic way possible, which made you valuable to potential future clients, but also incredibly dangerous to anyone who had ever employed you. Every successful assassination added to your reputation, while simultaneously making you a more attractive target for elimination by people who wanted to ensure their secrets stayed buried. The irony was that success in this profession created a paradox that was almost impossible to resolve. The better you became at your job, the more people wanted to hire you, but also the more people wanted to kill you. Each completed contract increased both your market value and your life expectancy in opposite directions, creating a trajectory that could only end in eventual capture, betrayal, or death. Your escape from the immediate aftermath of a successful assassination was just the beginning of a much longer and more complex game of survival that would define the rest of your probably abbreviated life. You had to start the whole deadly cycle over again in a new location, under a new identity, with even more enemies looking for you than before. Success didn't mean you could finally relax and enjoy the fruits of your labor. It meant you had to become even more paranoid, even more isolated, and even more careful about every aspect of your existence. So yes, you had made the kill and proven that you could complete the job that someone had paid you to do. Now you got to spend whatever time remained to you running like hell, sleeping in places that smelled like goat manure, bribing ferry captains with money you couldn't afford to spend, shaving your beard in the dark while trying not to cut your throat with a blade that was probably dull from your recent professional activities, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian while you attempted to blend in with a group of monks heading east toward destinations you knew nothing about. Because in the end, success in medieval assassination didn't mean survival. It meant you'd earned the right to start the whole terrifying process over again, this time with even higher stakes and even more people who wanted you dead. You had achieved the goal, completed the mission, and proven your worth. Your reward was the opportunity to keep running until someone faster, smarter, or luckier than you finally caught up. Let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived the kills, the lies, the poisonings, the betrayals, and all the creative attempts by former clients to solve their security problems by eliminating you permanently. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own sense of morality, which had been ground down to powder somewhere between your third assassination and the moment you stopped keeping count of how many people you'd killed. You managed to accumulate a small fortune despite being cheated out of most of your fees, avoided capture despite having your face sketched and distributed to every guard post in 3 kingdoms, and somehow retained enough of your sanity to contemplate what came next. Now what? You retire to a small cottage by the sea, hang up your daggers, and spend your golden years tending a garden while writing memoirs about your colorful career. Absolutely not. Because in medieval times, assassins didn't get retirement plans, pension funds, or farewell banquets where grateful colleagues wished them well in their future endeavors. There were no gold watches for 25 years of faithful service, no company parties celebrating your transition to civilian life, and definitely no peaceful cottages where you could grow vegetables and pretend you'd spent your working years as a traveling merchant specializing in exotic spices. What assassins got instead was a choice between disappearing completely or dying violently, and often they didn't get to make that choice themselves. The problem was elegantly simple and utterly unsolvable. You were never going to be safe. Not next week, not next year, not in a decade when everyone who remembered your face had supposedly died of old age or disease. Your past didn't fade away like a bad dream. It followed you everywhere like a persistent shadow, growing longer and darker with each passing year. You had accumulated too many secrets in your head, too many names in your memory, and far too much blood on your hands for anyone to feel comfortable with your continued existence. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which in practical terms usually meant buried in an unmarked grave somewhere far from civilization. Every successful assassination had created new enemies who would spend years plotting revenge against the man who'd killed their father, brother, lord, or business partner. Every client who'd hired you represented a potential security risk, because you knew their involvement in crimes that could destroy their reputations, their fortunes, and their lives if the information became public. Even if no one actively came after you, which was optimistic thinking bordering on delusional fantasy, you still had to live with the constant fear that someone might. Every knock on your door could be the moment your past finally caught up with you. Every stranger on the road might be a young assassin eager to make his reputation by eliminating a legendary figure from the previous generation. Every casual conversation carried the risk of accidentally revealing some detail that would connect you to crimes that were still remembered, still investigated, still punished with maximum brutality when the perpetrators were finally identified. So you changed your name again, because by this point you'd probably gone through more identities than a spy with multiple personality disorder. You moved to a village where nobody asked probing questions about your background, partly because they were too busy surviving their own problems to care about yours, and partly because places that didn't ask questions tended to be populated by people who had good reasons for avoiding scrutiny themselves. You developed a convincing cover story that explained your presence without requiring verifiable details about your past. Maybe you were a former soldier who'd been injured in some distant war that nobody in the area knew much about. Perhaps you claimed to be a merchant whose business had failed due to bandits, bad weather, or economic conditions beyond your control. You might have posed as a craftsman whose hands had been damaged in an accident, preventing you from continuing your previous trade but not from performing simpler tasks that didn't require fine motor skills. Whatever story you chose, it had to be mundane enough to discourage follow-up questions, while explaining any unusual aspects of your behavior that might otherwise attract attention. Your tendency to sit with your back to the wall and your eyes on the door had to seem like a reasonable precaution for someone who'd survived dangerous experiences, not a sign of professional paranoia developed through years of killing people for money. You couldn't be too successful in your new life, because prosperity drew attention from tax collectors, local authorities, and neighbors who might wonder how a simple herb seller or damaged craftsman had managed to accumulate enough wealth to live comfortably. But you also couldn't be too poor, because destitution would force you to seek charity or assistance that required providing detailed personal information to people who were trained to spot inconsistencies in the stories told by refugees, criminals, and other displaced persons. The psychological toll of maintaining a false identity for years was unlike anything you'd experienced during your active career. When you were working as an assassin, you'd use disguises and cover stories for days or weeks at most, always with the understanding that you'd eventually return to your real identity once the job was completed. But retirement meant committing to a fictional persona permanently, suppressing every aspect of your authentic personality that didn't fit with your new role. You had to forget skills that had taken years to develop, because demonstrating expertise in combat, stealth, or toxicology would raise uncomfortable questions about where you'd acquired such specialized knowledge. You couldn't react to danger with the lightning-fast reflexes that had kept you alive through dozens of life-threatening situations, because normal herb sellers and retired craftsmen didn't move like trained killers when they heard unexpected sounds in the night. Most challenging of all, you had to pretend that you'd never done anything more exciting or significant than whatever mundane occupation you'd chosen as your cover. You couldn't tell stories about interesting places you'd visited, because travel was expensive and unusual for people in your supposed social class. You couldn't display knowledge about politics, military affairs, or the personal habits of nobles, because such information wasn't typically available to common laborers and small merchants. This enforced ignorance was intellectually stifling in ways that gradually eroded your sense of self. You'd spent years learning to read people, anticipate their behaviors, and manipulate social situations to your advantage. These skills had become so fundamental to your identity that suppressing them felt like deliberately making yourself stupid, cutting away pieces of your personality until what remained was barely recognizable as the person you'd once been. The loneliness was perhaps worse than the fear. You couldn't form genuine relationships because every friendship was built on lies about who you were and what you'd done with your life. You couldn't trust anyone with your real thoughts, feelings, or experiences because sharing the truth would probably result in your immediate exposure and execution. You couldn't even trust yourself to maintain consistent stories about your fictional past because the strain of remembering which lies you'd told to which people was mentally exhausting. Romance was completely out of the question, not just because intimate relationships required the kind of trust and honesty that could get you killed, but because physical intimacy would reveal scars that didn't match your cover story. Your body told the true history of your career in knife wounds, arrow scars, and other injuries that would be difficult to explain as the results of farming accidents or mishaps with carpentry tools. Even if you found someone naive enough to believe whatever creative explanation you invented for your collection of suspicious scars, maintaining a long-term relationship would require sharing living space with someone who would eventually notice your sleeping habits, your reaction to unexpected visitors, and the various weapons you kept hidden throughout your residence for emergencies that normal people never anticipated. You also couldn't trust yourself around other people's problems or conflicts. When neighbors had disputes that turned violent, when local criminals threatened innocent families, when corrupt officials abused their authority, every instinct you developed over years of professional killing would urge you to solve these problems in ways that were efficient, permanent, and completely inappropriate for a retired herb seller who was supposed to be harmless. The knowledge that you could easily eliminate bad people who were making life difficult for good people was both a blessing and a curse. It was satisfying to know that you possessed skills that could make the world a better place, but using those skills would expose your true identity and probably result in your death, even if your motives were entirely altruistic. You had to watch injustices unfold without intervening, observe suffering that you could prevent without acting, and allow problems to persist that you could solve with a single night's work. This enforced passivity violated every principle you'd developed about taking action when action was needed, gradually transforming your competence into a source of frustration rather than pride. The financial management of retirement presented its own challenges. You couldn't invest your accumulated wealth in ways that would generate visible income, because explaining the source of your capital would require providing documentation and references that didn't exist. You couldn't buy property under your real name, since your real name was probably associated with multiple outstanding warrants and reward notices. You couldn't even keep large amounts of money in your residence, because a robbery or house fire could destroy your entire life savings in a matter of minutes. This meant hiding your wealth in ways that were secure but accessible, spreading it across multiple locations so that losing one cache wouldn't leave you destitute, but also remembering where you'd hidden everything without creating written records that could be discovered and used against you. You had to plan for contingencies that included having to flee your retirement location on short notice, which meant maintaining escape funds and emergency supplies that you hoped you'd never need but couldn't afford to be without. The gradual deterioration of your mental health was perhaps inevitable given the circumstances of your retirement. Years of isolation, paranoia, and suppressed identity took a psychological toll that accumulated slowly but relentlessly. You stopped dreaming about the future because planning ahead required hope, and hope was a luxury you couldn't afford when every day might be your last. You stopped forming attachments to places, possessions, or people because everything in your life was temporary and disposable. You developed the emotional equivalent of muscle memory that made it difficult to experience genuine joy, spontaneous laughter, or unguarded affection. Your responses to positive experiences were always filtered through calculations about potential risks and hidden dangers. Even moments of genuine happiness were contaminated by the awareness that they could be taken away instantly if your true identity was discovered. The irony was that retirement from assassination was in many ways more difficult than active practice of the profession had ever been. When you were working, you'd had clear objectives, defined enemies, and specific problems to solve. The dangers were immediate and obvious, but they were also temporary and manageable through skill, planning, and violence. Retirement offered no clear objectives beyond survival, no defined enemies beyond everyone who might eventually discover your secret, and no specific problems that could be solved through any action you were allowed to take. The dangers were vague and persistent, manageable only through eternal vigilance and the hope that your luck would hold indefinitely. You lived like a ghost, pretending to be a man, maintaining the appearance of normal human existence while being fundamentally disconnected from the community around you. You went through the motions of daily life without participating in the social bonds, shared experiences, and common purposes that gave other people's lives meaning and structure. The truth was that there was no endgame for a medieval assassin, no scenario in which you achieved final victory and lived happily ever after. There was only a slow, cold fade into obscurity, always moving, always watching, always waiting for the moment when someone faster, smarter, or more determined than you finally caught up. And perhaps that was the best you could hope for, to slip quietly into the darkness one day and simply never be seen again, leaving behind no trace that you'd ever existed except for the memories of people who were probably better off forgetting you anyway. And as we close this grim journey through the shadows of medieval desperation, I hope these tales of rusty daggers and broken promises have given you a different perspective on what history really looked like for the forgotten outcasts of society. From desperate peasants turned killers to the impossible choices that drove ordinary people into extraordinary darkness. These stories remind us that behind every romanticized legend lies a human truth, far more complex and tragic than fiction dares to imagine. If you found tonight's dark revelations as fascinating as they were disturbing, if these untold stories of medieval misery helped quiet the noise in your mind, please consider subscribing to Boring Sleepless History. We're building a community of fellow insomniacs and history lovers who appreciate the real stories behind the myths, the ones too brutal for textbooks and too honest for Hollywood. Hit that like button if learning about medieval assassins' actual survival rates made you grateful for your own problems, and ring the notification bell, not for urgent alerts, but for gentle reminders that there's always another forgotten quarter of history waiting to bore you peacefully to sleep. Next week, we'll drift through the surprisingly miserable world of medieval knights. Because if you think assassins had it rough, wait until you hear about trying to use the bathroom in full armor. We'll explore the reality behind the shining armor, the economics of being a professional warrior, and why most knights died of infection rather than glorious battle. Until then, may your own troubles seem manageable compared to hiding in haystacks with fleas and moral regret. Sweet dreams, fellow sleepless wanderers. History's darkest corners will be here waiting when insomnia calls again.